Chairwoman Zuma, who is just pulling up. Congressman Royce is not only the chair of the Foreign Relations Committee, which means he is one of the most important voices in this country on U.S. relations around the world and has been a particularly strong voice on relations with Africa. I should also say, however, he's a very good friend of the Wilson Center. We have been honored to have him as a speaker on a number of occasions, including to our Board of Trustees. He's a good friend of Jane Harman, our president, who is on the West Coast today. And without further ado, let me turn it over to Congressman Royce for his remarks. Thank you, Congressman, for being here this morning.
Yes, I am an enthusiast for the Wilson Center, and I appreciate all their good work and the great leadership, too, of Jane Harman. And let me begin by saying that I think this subject that you're investigating today, trade and investment partnerships between the African Union and the United States, I think this is a critical issue, one that, frankly, we've worked on for many, many years. And I see out in the audience many friends that worked with us on AGOA over the years. And I think that that particular initiative shows what we can do when we work in a bipartisan way with the diplomatic corps, and they throw their support into the effort, as well as the business community in Africa, and those NGOs, those organizations here in the United States that have a real long-term interest in figuring out how we really put Africa on the map for more trade and investment from the United States and around the world, and how we create an infrastructure, how we can help create an infrastructure in Africa that leads to the types of jobs that can lift people out of poverty. And frankly, going back to 2000 when we originally pushed AGOA through, Charlie Rangel and I and Jim McDermott traveled with President Bill Clinton at the time to Africa. I remember making the pitch halfway through that trip to have the president get on board with AGOA, which the three of us had co-sponsored. And thanks to him doing a little bit of arm twisting, and thanks to the good work of the diplomatic corps here in town, and thanks to the ability of those on both sides of the aisle to work in a bipartisan way, I was able to get that bill off the House floor and over to the Senate, and eventually we got it to the president's desk. And it did lead to hundreds of millions of dollars of additional investment. It led, frankly, to thousands and thousands of jobs. I can tell you in the trips that I've taken to Africa, and I've been in most of the countries in Africa, I've had the opportunity to see many people employed as a result of AGOA. But we are working closely right now with our ranking member, Elliot Engel, on the committee in order to extend AGOA. We're working with the Ways and Means chairman, Paul Ryan, and we're going to introduce that legislation very soon. We've not determined the date of introduction. It's going to be shortly, as I said, but we're still receiving input from the private sector. We have the Government Accountability Office doing an analysis right now. We have some studies from various think tanks here in the U.S. and in Africa. We've got a lot of input from civil society on what they'd like to see in order to strengthen AGOA. We've got input from the private sector, many businesses doing business there now, making suggestions of changes. And lastly, of course, the diplomatic community here has given us their input. So these improvements, I think, are going to help us increase the benefit that people in Africa receive from the Trade Preference Program. And I expect that AGOA's renewal text will include language to improve something that we've been working on for some time, trade capacity building, to increase the ability of African companies to export to the United States, and also trade facilitation to help remove the red tape and the bureaucratic barriers that is so needless in many cases and really thwarts the ability here to export. Transparency is another important part of AGOA, as you know. And if we can do some more on that front to help promote policy reforms and accountability, that's a good thing. Now, some of the measures we're considering include granting more flexibility to U.S. development agencies. So take MCC. giving them the ability to support regional efforts to bolster trade. Some will remember early on we really made an effort to try to get more free trade zones within sub-Saharan Africa, between countries, which I'm hopeful yet in our dialogue with African leaders we can help initiate here. We can leverage the internet so that companies on both sides of the Atlantic can learn about how to utilize AGOA, and we can foster U.S.-African private sector engagement, and these are other components. Increasing use of AGOA will happen if the U.S. works in partnership with African countries for policy changes to improve governance, that's another important issue, and improve the business climate in states across Africa. One option we're considering is requiring, and you can tell us what you think about this later, but requiring each AGOA country to develop its own strategy for policy reform, for actions to support businesses in their country, to give those businesses access to the U.S. market. We expect to include language to modernize AGOA and put the trade hubs online, giving African businesses that are not near the existing trade hubs the information that they need to send their exports to the United States. And I've been pressing for AGOA's extension for a much longer period of time than the previous extension. And I'm hopeful that the final number of years that we agree upon will give companies and governments the certainty they need. I was formerly in business, and I know one thing businesses do is plan long range. And one of the big disappointments to me is that these reauthorizations come up too soon. We should have a very long extension this time. Now, I would also add that as we work on this, we have had an opportunity. I think Nelmani Rubin is here in the audience, my senior advisor, Nelmani Rubin, and there in the back, and Warku Gachu is here with us. I will say one of the words of feedback I got from another committee was, we intended to roll you on this AGOA, but the chairman was so passionate about AGOA, and his senior staff is so nice that we decided, let's incorporate these changes. I do want to thank my team here for working with the community in order to try to strengthen AGOA in the way that we're trying to strengthen it. But I'd also like to mention Electrify Africa, because Nelmani's been working on this for a number of years. As you know, we got the bill through the House to the Senate last year. It was done in a bipartisan way, but we were never able to get it onto the calendar on the Senate side. And if we're going to do something to really help manufacturing in Africa, manufacturing companies have got to have a stable, reliable source of power. And the idea of having backup generators, it's far too expensive for light manufacturing. You need that dependability. Electrify Africa would probably cut in half the costs for electricity in Africa. But it has many, many benefits beyond just making the business sector more competitive, because frankly, what it would do for hospitals, what it would do for students at home or universities, if you look at the health, if you look at the eyesight, reading by kerosene and so forth, to replace all of that across sub-Saharan Africa, or much of sub-Saharan Africa, with this ability to have access to the grid, this would be a major, major investment. So we're going to reintroduce it shortly so that we can pass it into law. But I thank you all for your continued efforts, and I thank the Wilson Center for leaning in here, because this is really, really important as part of our long-term strategy to do everything we can do to put Africa on the map for trade and investment and build that infrastructure in Africa for trade and success worldwide, and for new opportunities for Africans. Thank you very much for having me here today.
Thank you, Congressman. We very much appreciate you taking time to come today, and especially we appreciate your strong commitment to Africa, to AGOA, to Electrify Africa, and to the larger relationship. Thank you, Congressman, for being here. We look forward to continued partnership with you. Thank you. It also gives me great pleasure, on behalf of Jane Harman, our president, and Dr. Monde Muyangwa, who will be chairing this session, to welcome the chairwoman of the African Union. Welcome, Chairwoman Zuma. Doctor, I'll do a brief introduction. You all have her bio, which is outside. You have a more extensive. Her trailblazing career is truly impressive, and I'm going to do a summary of it in the interest of time so she can make her remarks. She has a very packed day today, but she truly has an extraordinary record. Dr. Dlamini Zuma is the chairperson of the African Union Commission. She's an undisputed trailblazer in the upliftment and empowerment of women across the African continent and a true leader for democracy and for justice in Africa. She was an active underground member of the ANC. After the 1994 elections, she was appointed Minister of Health in the cabinet of then-President Nelson Mandela. She also served as Minister of Foreign Affairs under President Thabo Mbeki, and she served as well as Minister of Home Affairs in the current government. Since July 2012, she was elected in 2012 and has served as the chairperson of the African Union Commission. And this is a major achievement. I believe she's the first woman also who chairs this, but she is also, of any gender, one of the great leaders in Africa. And it gives us great honor to welcome Dr. Dlamini Zuma for remarks here at the Woodrow Wilson Center.
Thank you very much, Program Director, our Deputy Chair, and our Commissioner, and esteemed ladies and gentlemen. I'm really honored to address this meeting, and I'm sorry that it's so tight. I won't be able to stay with you because I have to go to the Hill to continue our lobby on AGOA. So I'm sorry about that, but you will have the able deputy and commissioner will come with me. Our deputy will then take the questions and continue the interaction. So I'm sorry. But just to say, when AGOA was authorized for the first time, it was around the same time as the millennium, and that summit in New York defined Africa as the first 21st century development challenge. So we were seen as a challenge to the world. But at the same time, Africa itself defined the 21st century as Africa's century. And at that time, we were also transforming our organization, the OAU, into the African Union, which was launched in 2002. And all of us dedicated ourselves to build the Africa that is integrated, peaceful, people-centered, and prosperous, and that will take its rightful place in the world. 15 years later, the narrative about Africa is changing because the continent itself is changing. It is now the second fastest growing region in the world, home to many of the world's fastest growing economies. Demographically, it is a continent of the future with its large youth population, and half of that population, of course, being women. It is also well endowed with natural and mineral resources, with land, water, and oceanic spaces. And yet, despite Africa being a rich continent, the Africans are poor. And that's the challenge that we must tackle. And its share of global trade is low. Production and wealth is marginal because we don't add value to our minerals and our natural resources. But of course, we have decided that that situation must change. And we decided to put a long-term program. Long-term because sometimes when you look at short-term issues, you get constrained by your immediate circumstances and you can't think beyond your constraints. So we decided that we are going to do a framework that will look up to 2063. Why 2063? Because our organization was founded in 1963. So we want to build an Africa that our children and grandchildren could look back and say, 100 years of the OAU, this is where we are. And we decided to do it differently from other programs we've had. We decided to go to the citizenry of Africa in their different sectors, different formations, women, health, students, business, farmers, faith-based organization, trade unionists, artists, you name them. We consulted, and the first draft of Agenda 2063 came from that consultation, not from government, not from experts, but came from the people. And basically, they were defining the Africa they want, the Africa they want to build, and the Africa they want to bequeath to their children and to their grandchildren. And so the number of priorities, I will just mention a few of those aspirations that our people said they would like to see. Of course, they said they want to see an integrated, united continent. And the second priority was investment in our most precious resource. And our most precious resource, like any other country, is our people. And so the investment in health, in education, shifting focus to science, technology, engineering, maths, making sure that we also get skills at all levels, vocational training, so that both our boys and girls, our young women and men, have skills to innovate, to create jobs, and also to get decent jobs themselves. And the second area of emphasis is agriculture, because we don't think Agenda 2063 can be achieved if we can't feed ourselves. And of course, we think the continent is capable of feeding itself and also assisting to feed the world. But there are a number of things that need to be done. And as we spoke to farmers, they raised a few things. The women farmers told us that they want better technology. They don't want to use the hand hoe anymore. That must be banished to the museum. This was what they said. And so in the next 10 years, we want to make sure that indeed it is banished to the museum. So we're looking at different technologies, tillers and other technologies. Secondly, they want land rights, because all along many countries do not have land rights for women. And I'm glad to say there are countries that have started looking at that. Ethiopia, which is my home right now, is one of those. And we hope that many others also that have not addressed this question will address them. They said they also want access to finance, and we are engaging financial institutions to see how we can make this a reality. But also women generally, those who are farmers, but also those who want to go into business, say they do want to have access to finance, and not only microfinance, because somehow micro has become equivalent to women. You talk women, oh, micro this, micro that, micro the other. So there's nothing micro about us, and we want to move away from that. And of course, we need the infrastructure, both the agricultural infrastructure and the general infrastructure, road, rail, aviation, ICT, water, sanitation, and other social infrastructure. And we would like to see more resources going to infrastructure. But we are happy to say all the infrastructure that's happening on the continent, 60% of it is coming from national resources, and only 40% is coming from outside. So there is a lot of commitment to building infrastructure. Of course, with building infrastructure, we also want to increase intra-African trade and global trade. But we can't trade unless we manufacture. And that's where AGOA comes in very handy as well, because it provides a ready market. So it provides incentive for African countries to increase their manufacturing capacity, because there's a market that they know they can send their things to. So this has contributed to a lot of growth in the manufacturing area and created jobs. And so we would like it to continue that way, but we would like it to be a bit more predictable so that we can plan long term. And of course, we also recognize that Agenda 2063 cannot happen if we don't look at the issues of democracy, participatory democracy. And I'm happy to say that in the continent, we can see democracy is getting stronger. And this year alone, we are going to have about 15 elections. We've had 4 already, Zambia, Lesotho, Comoros, Nigeria, and they've all gone very well. We have more coming, and we hope they'll all go very well. And of course, we also we're strengthening our institutions on governance, because we think good governance is very important for Agenda 2063. We also are looking at peace and security, which is a big challenge, not only in Africa, it's a challenge across the world. We've seen how the extremists have grown, and we have our own share of that as the world is also battling with extremism. But I'm proud to say Africa has its conflicts, but we have an architecture that kicks in and tries to contain any conflict that happens. You don't see conflicts raging and raging for years, destroying, killing, bombings, everything. So our peace and security architecture is very helpful. But of course, we are not the primary agent for international peace and security. The UN Security Council is. But on our continent, we try to play our part. And we hope that the Security Council will always be helpful to all of us in this way. We are also very happy to work with our partners and the US on areas like energy, because, of course, without energy, we can't manufacture, we can't do much. So energy is very important, but we also are very keen that we do not go on as we industrialize to start where the Industrial Revolution started. We want to start where technology is today. And that's why we want to have a mixture of clean energy, looking at hydro, looking at geothermal, looking at solar, looking at wind, we're looking at biomass, so that we are able to get a good mix and increasingly move towards the cleaner and renewable energies. And so we were happy with the cooperation we are having, but we need to accelerate that a lot more. We need to increase our agro-processing, because we are in a very strange situation where the majority of people are in agriculture. It shouldn't be. we should have people in agriculture, but more people in the processing and in the industry. So we are also growing our agro-processing and agri-industry. But we also think young people are important, and they must come in those areas, and not all of them should be in agriculture, but in all the value chains. We should be able to add value to our minerals. At the moment, our minerals are taken away, and when they come back to our continent, very few of us can afford them. Our agricultural products, whether it's cocoa or whatever, goes out unprocessed. When it comes back, very few of our children can afford the Swiss chocolates. So we need to also make sure that inside our continent we are able to manufacture and add value. But more importantly, of course, when you export raw materials, you export them with the jobs, with the high-end jobs. Because when you add value, that's where the high-end jobs are. And that's where the income is, the revenue is when you're selling finished products. So it means we are actually exporting jobs to other countries, and we're exporting revenue to other countries, and we'd like to reverse that. And that's what really Agenda 2063 is about. And as I say, manufacturing is the core of that agenda, and AGOA is an enabler for us. And so I'm glad that as the Congressman Edie Royce was talking, I realized that maybe we will get extension of AGOA, which would be longer and more predictable. And so it would be very helpful. And of course, we also looking at products like oil and so on, and we need to begin to add value there. The US is the biggest investor in Africa. I know there's a lot of talk about China, this, but the US is still the biggest investor. The difference is that the US invests mainly in the extractives. And sometimes they just get to sea, they take what they take out of the sea and out. And so we would like them to invest also in the manufacturing. And that's what other countries are doing. And so it's important that the US also goes in that direction, whilst they are in extractives, but they should also be a lot more in the manufacturing. So those are the few things that I wanted to share with you. My colleague, the deputy, will give you a bit more details. Just to say, this year we decided it's the year of women empowerment. Absolutely. It's 20 years after Beijing, but also it's the beginning of the Agenda 2063 implementation. We don't want women to be an add-on 10 years later. We want to make sure that they are integrated into Agenda 2063. And as we plan the first 10 years, women's issues are part of it. So we want more women in decision-making in all areas of endeavor, human endeavor, not just parliaments, important as they are, and we want more of them there. We want women to be presidents. We want them to be everywhere. Because that way, in business, that way, we will create a more just world. Yeah. We'll create more economic, but more inclusive and people-centered economic growth. Thank you.
Madam Chairperson, thank you so much. And I know you have to go to your next appointment, But I wanted to thank you first and foremost for the leadership role that you're playing at the African Union. The work that you have done in leading African countries and ordinary African citizens to articulating a vision for the Africa that they would like to see. And so we thank you for that. I just got back from Addis. Agenda 2063 was a major topic of discussion. And what was fascinating to me is that it was being discussed not just at the government level, but at the ordinary African citizen level, with everybody feeling pretty much that they had had an opportunity to provide input, and that therefore this put Africa in a much better standing on the implementation side. It is still going to take a lot on implementation, but this is a wonderful, wonderful start, I think. And then secondly, I think your very presence there as a woman gives many, many millions of young African girls, they can see, they can visualize the possibilities. And so we thank you for all that you are doing on that platform at the African Union. We know there's a lot of work to do in security and economic development and governance, but we think you've laid a pretty strong foundation. And with that, please join me in thanking the chairperson for joining us for a few minutes. I know she has to run. We really would have loved to engage in a discussion with you, but we're sure Mr. Mwencha here will do an excellent job of answering all of our questions and engaging with us on this issue. So Chairperson Zuma, thank you. Prince, could I ask you to please facilitate the chairperson's departure through the exit so she can get to her next appointment? Commissioner Sil, thank you very much. And I know you have important work on the Hill. We're sorry we're going to miss your voice, but I know you'll be back. Thank you. All right, so it's just me and Honorable Mwencha now. And I know we're running behind. I'll take just three questions. 3 questions for Honorable Mwencha, and if you would keep them short and give him an opportunity to respond and to speak to any issue that the chairperson perhaps didn't have an opportunity to touch on. So the floor is open. 3 very quick questions. I'll take the gentleman over here. You have the mic, please.
Good to see you again, Honorable Chairperson, Deputy Chairperson. Years ago, there was talk about economic institutions that would be created for the African continent, African Monetary Union and African Investment Bank, things of that nature. Has there been any progress on those economic institutions, and how would they channel into this effort to increase investment and trade in Agenda 2063?
Thank you. One more question. I will add to that. I think one of the areas where Africa is often given a hard time is on the implementation side of things. That Africa has wonderful plans, and that when it comes to implementation, this is where the deficit often tends to occur. I did my BA dissertation on the Lagos Plan of Action. And so my question to you would be, how different is Agenda 2063 from the Lagos Plan of Action and other such plans that the continent has developed in the past?
Steve Landy, it's a great pleasure to be able to speak to Mr. Mwencha, because Deputy Chairperson Mwencha, because few people may realize, but he started the whole movement towards Continental Free Trade Agreement when he was with COMESA as their Director General, which was the first group that really put together Southern Africa, Eastern Africa, and even up as far as almost Northern Africa, Djibouti and other countries. Everyone is excited because we've heard this concept of the Continental Free Trade Agreement. Some of us even hope we'll go Continental Free Trade Agreement, African Customs Union, like call for in Lagos, and have it finished by 2020. But the picture is that if we go that schedule, and if AGOA is extended for at least 10 years, we could have the possibility of a mega negotiation between Africa and the U.S. without the divisive impact as caused when the European community negotiated with individual countries or groups of countries. What is your own current outlook of the Continental Free Trade Agreement, and do you think it will eventually meld into something that can also be considered a successor to AGOA, since the U.S. could participate? Thank you.
Honorable Major.
Is this okay? Well, first of all, thank you very much, Monday. Always good to see you, and for Woodrow Center for inviting us and giving us this opportunity to be here again. I think I was with you about 2 months ago in this very room. I thought I would have just wanted to add 1 or 2 remarks to what Congressman Eddie Royce said. We had a little chat in the holding room, and because he had a heavy schedule, he had to leave because he had wanted us to engage each other on 1 or 2 aspects, particularly in the details of the legislation that is yet to be introduced before Congress or Senate. Admittedly, I mean, those who remember, and I was fortunate to be part of that team, people like Steve and others, but in the 90s when AGOA was mooted under President Clinton, there was skepticism. Some said, well, we shouldn't be talking about trade, we should be talking about aid. But those of us who argued said, let's have trade, and aid was welcome. And I think time has proven that that was the right path to take, given what AGOA has been able to accomplish. But we know it hasn't accomplished much for a number of reasons. It could have accomplished more. And these are the details that I would have wanted to discuss with them. And of course, we mentioned to Eddie, and my boss has gone to Capitol Hill to try and bring these points home. One of the challenges that AGOA has always had is to make it investment friendly. And for the reason that my boss mentioned before she left, making it more predictable. Now, the eligibility criteria that is in the current AGOA act doesn't give it that stability, that predictability. And for reasons that are very clear to us, all of us, that yes, we know that a number of our countries in Africa, we are in transition period, and some fragility cannot be ruled out. And because of that, you can find sometimes a country stumbling along the road, and because of that, that eligibility criteria then kicks in, and a country could lose its access. Now, we would have wanted to suggest some language in it, because at the moment it has only 2 possibilities. It's either green or red. And because it is a unilateral instrument, there is no provision for intervention to see some intermediate stage. And I hope that will be incorporated. But I'm saying so because Congressman Ed was saying that a number of you have also made presentations, and I would like to get your response, what you think about that. The second one, and I think this is the point that Steve is driving at also, when he talked about regional integration in the continent. Because ultimately, I think the US should see Africa as a long-term partner. And as a long partner, we should nurture a relationship in such a manner that Africa becomes a really, investment partner in the long run. With opportunities that exist. And there is a lot of complementarity between the US and African economy. And that aspect, AGOA should encourage the African capacity by way of regional integration, which we know will boost and create capacity within the continent to be able to consume more US goods. And that's the investment that US should make. Looking at Africa as a future partner that will continue to take more and more US goods. And so, building in a mechanism for regional integration is extremely important in the AGOA legislation. And one of the aspects one would offer is looking at issues like rules of origin that would encourage Africa to join the global value chain or a global supply chain system. And we don't seem to disagree on this. The question is, at the moment, we hear all sorts of things that some are saying, well, if you tamper with the AGOA cities, with all the petitions from the private sector, then you might delay it and some people might mark it up. We don't believe that really, AGOA, even when you look at the impact it has in the US economy, is less than 2%. And if well explained, I think those that would oppose should really perhaps see it in a different way, as I said, as an investment for future. The third area is we also believe that much as Congressman Royce is talking of Africa having reforms and showing transparency and the rest, we believe there is also some reform that it requires in the US itself. And so those reforms, particularly, not only having Africa having capacity, trade hubs, yes, providing support in most of those areas, okay. At the moment, there are exporters who will tell you, products that are available in Africa, but entering the US market takes forever. You go into the SPS areas, the queue is forever, and you don't know actually that transparency when you enter that door, when you come out. And so we need also reform on the part of the US to be able to make its access more transparent in some of those areas that I've just mentioned. Now let me come back to the questions, and my good friend John has asked a question on African financial sector. And actually it's also linked to a question that you raised, Monde, on implementation, because to me that's the key. Now, first of all, on the institutions, yes, progress has not been as fast, but I think you'll see, we pick up some speed in the coming days because a lot of groundwork has been done. I think the public that went with it assumed that all the preparatory work had been done, which was a bit premature, and he knows what he's talking about, having served as a U.S. ambassador. In fact, was one of the very first U.S. ambassador to the African Union, and so he's well exposed. But that scenario is changing, and in fact, if you look at the model, the way it was conceived, was also had some elements that needed to be fine-tuned. And so there is a lot of work now being done. But I wouldn't see this as a major gap at the moment that is of a major issue. Admittedly, Africa needs it, but I would, if I was to prioritize, I would not put it at a front burner issue. But it is one of those major issues that we will carry along as integration deepens. On implementation, and I think this is key, Monde, that you raised. You've talked about frameworks like the Lagos Plan of Action, the Abuja, and all that. But why has implementation not been as... in fact, that also answers partly of why Agenda 2063 has been designed differently. And I'm glad you yourself mentioned in your own, parting words with the chairperson that you have seen grassroots involvement. Many of the schemes, if you go back, they were kind of intellectual in approach, but also resource to finance them was assumed, that it would, be there. This scenario has changed. In fact, just like globally under the post-2015 development agenda, there is a lot of discussion now on how to finance it. Africa has been debating this on its own, way ahead of the global agenda. And recently, we have come to the conclusion that we must mobilize resources within the continent. If you look at implementation of our programs, the investment gaps that we have, why many of the programs never succeeded, is because there was too much reliance on external financing. And that's why the chair was saying, Africa is rich, but only Africans are poor. In fact, if you look at the resources, for instance, studies that have been done on illicit financial flows, but also capacity to generate some of the funds internally, the possibilities are enormous. So one aspect, at least in the model of the new Agenda 2063, is financing mechanism, but also ownership, which that I've just talked about, which is quite different from the previous schemes. Now, Steve's question relating to the continental free trade area, he also links it to something very interesting, which personally I also believe in. And this is where I part with many people. My personal opinion, I must say. We cannot talk of extend AGOA forever. You can't in today's world. We must think of a day that AGOA will have to be reciprocal. And hence, for us to build in it a mechanism to say, do AGOA for 15 years. But during that period, develop a mechanism that will transit to reciprocity. And part of that is really what Steve is saying. That scheme must then focus on having capacity in Africa in terms of integration. And the continental free trade area that he asked, what is the possibility? I would say very bright. Steve knows that, as he indicated, we now have regional integration schemes that are quite mature. We have, East African Community, COMESA, SADC, which have really gone far in terms of market integration. I mean, you still have challenges in trade facilitation, in trade, and all this. But notionally, in terms of removing tariffs and seeing goods moving across, they're happening. And we are seeing now, in fact, there is already a plan to launch a tripartite free trade area intercoming in June. That will be almost half of the continent. Now the question then is, if you already have southern, eastern, and almost northern, because it will include Egypt and others, how do you now move west and central so that you can bring it? And there's a lot of focus. My colleague was just left here. She would have told you that in June, we are now going to launch steps towards the 2017 continental free trade area. And for me, with the hindsight and the knowledge that I see how we were able to launch the COMESA free trade area in 2000, that is not rocket science. It should happen. And so I'm very positive about it. And that is the answer that I would give Steve. But that should also be built in, even in AGOA, that the U.S. itself should have interest in supporting those kind of schemes, so that this is the investment that the U.S. is making for the future, because a strong Africa is a good partner for the U.S. in the long run.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
I hate to bring this to a close because I feel like we're just really now getting into the issues, but I recognize that we have run over time. I hear, first of all, thank you for coming and speaking with us, and I do hope that when you're back in Washington, we'll have an opportunity to continue this dialogue and this discussion. What I hear on this Agenda 2063 is Africa has articulated a really, really powerful vision of where it wants to be in 2063. And I must admit, I was a skeptic before I went to Addis last week, just wondering, thinking this was, okay, yet another plan that Africans were coming up with that wouldn't go anywhere. But in talking to just ordinary people, people from think tanks, people from NGOs, and others that I met around Addis, it became very clear to me very quickly that this had been done differently. And therefore, one hopes that the prospects for success are much higher than previous plans, as you mentioned. But I think a second issue for me has, and I hear this in part of what you're saying, that Agenda 2063 addresses many of the political risks and other factors that have tended to hinder engagement, international engagement on the trade and investment front. And so hopefully we will make progress on that front as well. Having said that, I think a missing piece, and maybe it's not missing, it could be that I just don't understand how this factor has been accounted for me has to do with how potential outside partners see Agenda 2063, see the opportunities for engagement. Because you have Africa standing here and saying, here's how we see the continent that we want to get to. And part of that vision for 2063 includes a role for international partners. And I think a very direct address of the concerns that international partners have should be factored into that, whether it's challenging the narrative of how international partners see Africa, or it's addressing some real issues. I think somehow we have to find a way of very directly answering those questions, those concerns, and those issues. For me, that would make it a much fuller document. Understanding, of course, that Africa is in the driver's seat. I think that's very clear from 2063. And with that, I think I just want to thank all of you for coming. I'm really sorry, about all the moving parts and the fact that we weren't able to really have a much deeper and substantive discussion in terms of the number of questions and exchanges. But Honorable Mancha, thank you very much. And to all of you, thank you for coming.
Okay. You want us to stand or?
We will. Oops, I'm just about to trip over my.